Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 12.4, Identify Ways that Aggression Can Be Reduced. One of the first questions that may be coming to your mind is, what is the impact of punishment on aggressive behavior? Yesterday, I was doing my usual doom scrolling. I tend to give myself, a half an hour a day to just watch garbage on Reels or on TikTok, and I saw there's some reverse the camera trend that's going around TikTok right now. I'm not sure I understand it fully, but one video I saw was a woman who was obviously a parent, and in her video she was addressing her kid and said, "If I see you doing that reverse the camera nonsense, there's going to be a whooping on your backside." And, forgive my really, really pathetic Southern accent. I think this person was from Tennessee. But, does punishment actually work? The research here is interesting. I find it really challenging to interpret, but also really complex. So if punishment takes the form of an aggressive act in itself, like a spanking, a smack, whatever, what you're doing as the punisher is actually modeling more aggressive behavior for the person whose aggressive behavior you're trying to stop. So what you're sending is actually mixed messages. So you hurt your little sister, I'm going to hurt you harder. Now what you're modeling is actual aggressive behavior in response to aggressive behavior. And that's not clear, particularly to children. What you're actually showing them is there are bad consequences when I get caught being aggressive, but my parent is being aggressive to me, so what does that mean? Generally speaking, threats of severe punishment, you may avoid the behavior with that threat of a severe punishment. You may avoid it, but you may not say to yourself, oh, that means that behavior is actually morally wrong. What you say to yourself is, that punishment is really wicked, so I'm not going to engage in the behavior that I'd really rather do, right? So if you say to a couple of toddlers, toddler A has been throwing sand into the eyes of toddler B, and if you say to toddler A, if you throw sand in toddler B's face one more time, I am going to pick you up by the scruff of your neck, pull down your pants, and spank your backside raw. That's a threat of a severe punishment. It's also child abuse. You're likely, if you're that toddler A, to say, okay, fine, I won't throw the sand. At least not when you're looking, because I still really want to throw the sand. Because it's funny to me, right? So threats of severe punishment actually just aren't particularly effective. They just make people inhibit their behavior while they're being watched, then they wait until they're not being watched, and they engage in the behavior anyway. If, however, and remember that misattribution kind of effect, and that effect in an earlier chapter called the over-justification effect, if we threaten negative behaviors with a relatively milder punishment, like toddler A has been throwing sand in toddler B's face, if I say to toddler A, that's really disappointing. I'm very disappointed in you. We value niceness in this family, and you have disappointed me. You do it again, I'm going to be even more disappointed. Now, in comparison to beating your behind raw, that is a threat of a mild punishment. Now, what can happen is that if that child resists throwing sand in toddler B's face, they have to sit back and say, why didn't I throw the sand? If they're facing a severe punishment and they ask themselves, why didn't I throw the sand? It's because I don't want to get my butt beat raw. If, however, the threat of the punishment is simply a grown-up being disappointed, you have to sit back and say, why didn't I throw the sand? You may come up with an alternate explanation. throwing sand is bad. So what researchers have found is if you want to convert a person's behavior, if you want them to internalize a value or a norm that passive, non-aggressive, non-violent behavior is good and aggressive, violent behavior is bad, the threats need to be relatively mild and hard to identify as the cause of the change in behavior. Because what you want the child to do is say to themselves, I chose this action because it was the right action to do. You don't want them to say, I chose this action because I don't want to get punished really harshly. Because that leaves intact their desire to engage in the behavior. It's like speeding. Many of us really enjoy driving fast. And the only time we slow down and mind the speed limit is if there are cops around. Especially on a holiday, when there are holiday rates on those speeding tickets, and there's a possibility of, your insurance rates going up and all that nonsense. So that's a relatively harsh threat. In your environment, you get slowed down, you have to pay money, you have to do all these things, and it's really unpleasant. The only reason you're slowing down is so you don't get stopped. You're not saying to yourself, speeding is bad or wrong. See what I mean? So what does the research say about using punishments with violent adults? So far we've talked about research with kids. Threats of harsh punishment, do those make violent crimes less likely? The prevailing research tends to suggest that with adults, so these are mostly college students that have been in laboratory experiments, punishment can act as a deterrent if it's swift and the person can't avoid it. So just like with little kids, if you want to correct a behavior using a punishment, you need to make it fast, immediate, unavoidable. Now, our justice system doesn't work like that, right? If you're talking about criminal punishments for people doing bad things, they rarely get the punishment in the moment. They rarely get caught in the moment. They're caught days, weeks, months, years later. Then there's the court proceedings. Then there's the whole process thing. The punishment is rarely going to be immediate, and it sometimes is completely avoidable. So you may make a plea deal. You may get time served. You may, pay a fine instead of going to jail, whatever. We don't have those perfect conditions for making punishment effective. And severe punishments don't tend to be deterrent at all, especially in the real world where you have the possibility of escaping punishment, of not being detected. And if you have people, even under threats of severe punishment, what they try to do is very carefully determine when they can commit their crimes without being seen, without being detected, and without being caught. So outside of that controlled laboratory setting, punishment is simply not particularly effective if you're talking about the goal of deterring crime. One very old theory about aggression, and Bandura in the archival footage that I showed you in a previous video talked about this a little bit. Freudian theory suggested that if people engage in aggressive behavior, even if it's pseudo-aggression, where, acting out through sport or through competitive business or competitive games, it should be cathartic, meaning you have less need to behave aggressively. So catharsis is basically this idea that if you blow off steam, you'll be less likely to be violent with others. And that's, part of our conventional wisdom is that we can relieve built up anger and aggressive energy, and then that should reduce the likelihood of later aggressive behaviors. Freud referred to this as a hydraulic theory, where you can release the pressure valve by engaging in socially acceptable forms of aggressive behavior, And that should relieve you of the vulnerability to committing aggressive acts that you don't want to behave in. Now, Freud's theory never really had much empirical support at all. Modern psychologists look at the original theory as being woefully oversimplified. The idea that if you vent your anger, you will be in a better place, has pretty much been debunked. Many psychoanalysts at the time of Freud and even later believed that competitive games were a really great way to regulate aggressive behavior, but in fact the opposite appears to be true. Engaging in and even just watching competitive games tends to make people more prone to aggressive behavior. Watch the fans at any college football game this weekend, and you will see that just being a part of that thing, that sporting event, puts you in a mindset that makes you vulnerable to acting out. Many people actually feel worse, both physically and psychologically, after they have engaged in an angry outburst. People don't describe it as being a release. They describe it as being exhausting, more likely. Another kind of outgrowth of aggression, or not really outgrowth, but a kind of a corollary theory that's connected to that effect that I described previously, where we tend to dehumanize people. We often tend to blame the victim. So if we are observing or hearing about or reading about a person who's been a victim of a violent crime, as observers, we often will find ways to restore our own sense of safety and security by blaming the victim. What's been found in research is that participants who have been put in a situation, so remember that game-playing situation where they get to inflict some kind of psychological or physical harm on an innocent, what they tend to do after the fact is blame their victims. So they tend to talk trash about them. They tend to try to convince themselves that the victim deserved what they got. And that can actually involve kind of rewriting the story of how the event occurred. This can make it easier for them to do future harm to that person. It can make it easier for them to make a similar explanation of similar crimes and events. Basically, what happens is when you aggress against someone else, that puts you in a position where you're experiencing dissonance and you're wanting to find some self-justification for doing that. So how do we reduce aggressive behavior? One of the things that researchers have found is that you can learn active processes for countering angry thoughts, for dealing with frustration, for coping with provocation. And one of these is called actively enabling, using skills, grounding skills like counting and breathing to dissipate those angry feelings until the physiological arousal associated with them decreases. Those expressions of anger may help you to get some insight into yourself, into the dynamics of your connections to other people. When you are trying to resolve conflicts, the best practice is to tell the person that you are in fact angry, that you would like to resolve the conflict. And if you are at fault for something, apologies can go a very, very long distance. So take responsibility, apologize, indicate that it's not likely that you're going to engage in that behavior again. If you want to help other people behave non-aggressively, model non-aggressive behavior, especially if you are engaged in the care of children. Teaching people effective communication strategies. One of my counselor friends talks about it as gentle fighting. teaching people to fight fair, to communicate effectively, and to use good, solid problem-solving skills. Communication shouldn't be about wins and losses. It should be about being understood, being heard, and being known. And those things reduce aggression. Bottom line, the more empathy you have toward other people and the more empathy that you get from other people, the less likely aggression is to occur. So how does empathy counter dehumanization? When we teach people, it doesn't matter what age, when we are able to build empathy by teaching them empathy skills, aggressive acts become more difficult to commit. Because what you are seeing the person. You are seeing their eyes, you're seeing their face, you're seeing and understanding their context. So in one study, students who went through an empathy training behaved far less aggressively toward another person than other students who had not received the training when they were put into a game-playing situation. So what does it take to learn empathy? One exercise that has been shown to be effective is to encourage people to visualize and think about other people. So you could be thinking about your intimate partner, a friend, a family member, a coworker. So get them firmly in mind. Ask yourself some questions. What has their mood been like today? What has their mood been like for several days? Like one of my kids right now is in a crisis because they lost something very, very important to them and they can't find it. So I'm thinking about them and I'm thinking how frustrated and upset and angry and sad they are right in this moment. What's going on in this person's life that might be making them so anxious and sad and angry? Well, my kiddo is a college student. It's week 12. It's a nightmare. They are stressed. They are tired. They have not been sleeping. Now they've lost this object that they find precious. So that's a lot of what's going on for them. Are there things that I have done that have contributed to this? I have been emotionally unavailable to my kid in the last couple of days. I've been overwhelmed with work, been overwhelmed with other responsibilities to other family members. Maybe my lack of being accessible has contributed to their distress. And then what could I do or say to improve that person's situation? There are probably some things I could do to help them find the object, to help them replace the object that they've lost, to help them feel more comfortable with their situation, to reduce some of their anxiety about other things. I can be more supportive. So when you do an exercise like this, and this is a classic empathy building exercise, you can exercise the same set of skills in other situations, especially if you challenge yourself by identifying someone that you don't particularly like, but you do this. You walk through these 5 steps with that person that you don't particularly like, then you start to build empathy and connection and compassion for that person. Another thing that has been used in empathy training workshops and courses is something called disrupting the rejection rage cycle. Bullying and aggressive retaliation are major problems in our world. I'm sure that you had a lot of programs in your school life in K through 12 addressing bullying, and I'm sure that many of you have had exposures to being bullied or having to respond to bullies. I'm sure, 100% sure, you've witnessed it. So how do we break that cycle of being bullied and then aggressively retaliating? There are some interventions that have been designed using the idea that you need to find people within that community, within that social grouping, who are known, respected, and liked. And they can become norm leaders. They can become people who communicate norms that are inconsistent with bullying and aggressive retaliation. What researchers did was to map out social networks among middle schoolers, and I can imagine that was quite the challenge. And then they randomly assigned students in some of these schools to create these anti-conflict groups. Students in the intervention groups then designed campaigns. So the students who were planted in the groups were already pre-trained. And what they did in these intervention groups was to create anti-bullying campaigns with good media, with shareable images, and those things were then implemented in the school. They were student produced. And that's a really critical component to these programs. 1 year later, these schools that had these programs, these intervention groups, they actually reported a pretty substantial reduction in disciplinary reports that involved peer conflicts. So it is possible to disrupt that cycle, especially when you have students who step in and become normative leaders, and if you have student-led interventions that can encourage the development of new norms that are in opposition to those aggressive, violent patterns of behavior. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 12.